A tank is supposed to fight with distance on its side. The crew is meant to spot danger early, bring the gun onto it before that danger gets too close, and use armor and movement together while the battlefield is still wide enough to manage. A city ruins that almost at once. The moment armor enters a built-up area, the range collapses, the sight lines shorten, and the crew starts moving through ground where an enemy can stay hidden until the tank is only a few seconds away. That was what made urban fighting so dangerous for armored forces long before the Panzerfaust appeared. Inside a city, the battlefield stopped behaving like open country and started breaking into fragments. A street might look clear and still hide a threat behind the next wall. A building that seemed abandoned could hold men on an upper floor waiting for the right angle. A cellar, a side alley, or even a hole blasted through one room into another could become a firing point that only revealed itself after the tank had already gone too far to react properly. Once that happened, the tank lost many of the things that usually kept it alive. There was less room to maneuver, less time to identify where the attack was coming from, and far less certainty that supporting infantry would still be close enough to protect it from short-range ambush. Crews could still use their vehicles effectively in cities, and they often had to, because tanks were still valuable for smashing strong points and supporting assaults. But the city forced them into a kind of fight where danger could appear suddenly from above, from behind, or from a doorway the crew had already passed. By the final stage of the war, that was exactly the kind of ground German defenders were learning to exploit. They no longer needed large anti-tank guns dragged into perfect positions for every encounter. What they increasingly needed was a weapon that one man could carry through rubble, hide inside ruins, and fire at the exact moment a tank came too close. Cities were already difficult for armor. The Panzerfaust turned that difficulty into something much worse. Late war Germany needed an anti-tank weapon that could move through rubble as easily as the infantry carrying it. Bigger anti-tank guns still had their place, but they were harder to reposition once the fighting pushed into damaged streets and broken city blocks. A gun with wheels, a crew, and a towing vehicle was useful when there was space to prepare a field of fire. It was much less useful when the battlefield kept breaking into stairwells, courtyards, smashed intersections, and short streets where tanks could appear with very little warning. That was the kind of war the Panzerfaust fit. It was a simple disposable launcher built around a shaped charge warhead, and simplicity was one of its greatest strengths. The tube itself was cheap and light enough to hand out widely, while the warhead did the real work. When it struck armor, it did not rely on speed the way a tank shell or anti-tank gun round did. It relied on the shaped charge effect, focusing explosive energy into a narrow jet capable of burning through armor far thicker than a weapon of that size had any right to defeat. That was what made it so dangerous. A soldier did not need a heavy gun to threaten a tank anymore. He needed a launcher, a corner to hide behind, and the nerve to wait until the target was close enough. The trade-off was range, and the weapon made no attempt to hide that. Panzerfaust models improved over time, but the whole idea remained built around short-distance fighting. The operator was expected to let the tank come in close, fire once, and then survive if he could. That sounds crude compared with larger anti-tank systems, but in city fighting, it was often exactly the right kind of crude. Streets shortened engagement distances on their own. Buildings blocked long lines of fire. Tanks were forced into routes defenders could predict. In that setting, a weapon designed for a close shot stopped looking limited and started looking perfectly suited to the ground. Its construction matched that purpose. The launcher was not something you kept reloading through a prolonged duel. It was issued as a one-shot weapon because that was how it was meant to be used. A hidden infantryman could carry it into position, wait for the right angle, fire at side or rear armor, and then either move or die where he stood. Germany could spread thousands of these through formations that were increasingly fighting defensively, and once that happened, the threat to tanks became much harder to map. The danger was no longer tied only to prepared gun pits or obvious anti-tank strongpoints. It could now sit in the hands of ordinary infantry hidden inside the city itself. That was the deeper reason the Panzerfaust mattered so much. It gave late-war German defenders a weapon powerful enough to kill a tank, simple enough to issue in huge numbers, and practical enough to use in the exact conditions where cities were already making armored movement dangerous. Once the Panzerfaust was in the hands of large numbers of infantry, infantry, the danger to tanks stopped sitting in obvious places. Before that, crews could at least think in terms of anti-tank guns, prepared positions, and the usual fields of fire that came with them. A city changed that, and the Panzerfaust changed it even more. The weapon was small enough to move through buildings, simple enough to keep ready in cramped positions, and short-ranged enough that the man using it could stay hidden until the tank was almost where he wanted it. That mattered because city fighting constantly pushed armor into predictable paths. A tank could not drive through the middle of a block in any direction it liked. It had streets, intersections, courtyards, and rubble-choked gaps to work with, and all of those narrowed its choices. German defenders could read that ground just as well as the tank crews could, which meant they often knew where the vehicle would have to slow, where it would need to turn, and where its side armor might be exposed for a second longer than usual. A shot did not have to come from some dramatic rooftop position to be dangerous. It could come from an upstairs room after the wall had already been knocked away. It could come from a cellar opening at street level. It could come from behind a smashed doorway, from the shell of a tram depot, from a courtyard that looked empty, or from a room a tank had just passed and assumed was dead ground. That was what made the atmosphere of city fighting so bad for armor. The city allowed anti-tank teams to stack danger in layers. One soldier could wait high, another lower, another farther down the street, all watching for the same vehicle from angles that were difficult to cover at once. Even when the first shot missed or hit badly, the tank had already been forced into the worst possible situation. Because once the crew knew a Panzerfaust team was nearby, every opening around them started feeling dangerous. That made supporting infantry more important and at the same time harder to keep effective. Tank crews needed soldiers nearby to clear buildings, watch side streets, and stop anti-tank teams before they got into range. The city kept breaking that cooperation apart. A clean penetration at the right angle could kill crew members instantly with blast and fragments or ignite fuel and ammunition if the internal layout was unforgiving. Even when the tank did not explode, the fighting compartment could fill with smoke, dust, metal splinters, and fire suppression chemicals while the crew tried to understand what had happened and whether another shot was already on the way. A vehicle that looked intact from the outside could still be half blind, damaged internally, or seconds away from being abandoned. The worst part was that city fighting rarely gave tank crews time to recover properly. In open ground, a damaged vehicle might still have room to reposition or receive cover from nearby units. In a city, the same tank was often sitting inside a short street where every doorway and upper floor remained a threat. If the first hit did not kill it, the crew still had to worry about the second team waiting farther down the block or on another level of the same building line. The reason the Panzerfaust became so tied to city fighting is that the last phase of the war kept producing exactly the kind of battles it was made for. By then, whole capitals and major urban centers were turning into defensive zones, and every ruined district gave infantry more ways to let tanks come close before hitting them. You can see that pattern clearly in places like Warsaw, Budapest, and Berlin, where armored vehicles were still essential to the fighting and yet were constantly being dragged into streets that favored the men waiting for them. Warsaw showed how quickly armor could become vulnerable once the battle moved inside a city, and the defenders knew the ground better than the vehicles entering it. Streets were narrow, buildings gave cover at multiple heights, and movement kept being broken up by barricades, rubble, and sudden fire from angles tanks were never comfortable facing. A vehicle could still blast a strong point and help force a route open, but every block it crossed gave hidden infantry another chance to attack it from close range. Budapest made the same lesson even harsher. The fighting there went on for weeks in a city already damaged by bombardment and then further destroyed by street battles, which meant tanks were operating in a landscape that was becoming more restrictive by the day. German and Hungarian defenders could use buildings, courtyards, cellars, and broken street lines to stage short-range attacks against Soviet armor, while Soviet tank crews had to keep moving through ground that gave them very little certainty about what was waiting ahead. Berlin was where all of this reached its most famous form. The city was full of exhausted troops, Volkssturm units, Hitler Youth, and regular soldiers, many of them carrying Panzerfausts because Germany no longer had the luxury of relying only on specialist anti-tank formations. Soviet armor advancing into Berlin still had immense firepower, but it was now entering a city that had become one huge close-range battlefield. Side streets, cellar openings, rail embankments, stairwells, stairwells, smashed facades, and upper floors all gave defenders places to wait for the shot they wanted. That was where the Panzerfaust proved how much damage a cheap infantry weapon could do when the battlefield kept delivering tanks into its ideal range. It did not save Germany, and it did not reverse the collapse of the front, but it made those final urban battles far bloodier and more dangerous for the armored forces driving into them.